This past week, as you were completing your 5 by 5 by 5 readings in the Gospel of John, you read a story about the baptism of Jesus in John chapter 1. Front and center in that story was a man named John, not John who wrote the words, but John, the character in the story, a man that we would come to know as John the Baptist. Actually, he was a cousin of Jesus, and he's known to most of us as John the Baptist, but he's not the writer of that gospel. This John the Baptist, had a very specific role to play in the story of Jesus. John's gospel tells us that John the Baptist came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. In other words, we might say that the role of John the Baptist was to pave the way for Jesus. His job was to help people see Jesus. And that's the intent of our sermon series that we're in right now, that we might all see Jesus. In your reading, people kept asking John the Baptist if he were the Messiah, if he was the character who was supposed to be coming. After all, John the Baptist was a very unique character. He looked weird, he talked weird, he did all kinds of things that were so out of the ordinary. People thought he must have been someone that came along that line. But John knew his role, and he kept telling people over and over again, I'm not the Messiah, I am not the Messiah. To the priest and everybody who came, he openly confessed, the text tells us. Then one day, as you will still read in John chapter 1, as you read this past week, John the Baptist was preaching and baptizing, and he looked up and he saw Jesus coming toward him. And he yelled out to the crowd that was there, here he is! This is God's Passover lamb. He's the one who forgives the sins of the world. This is the man I've been talking about. So John did it. He did what he was supposed to do. He pointed the people to Jesus. And he also told them that this Jesus was the one who had come for a very specific purpose, to forgive the sins of the world. That's the same message that gets taught in our Hebrews text that Kathy read for you just a moment ago. In our quest throughout this series of sermons to see Jesus in the book of Hebrews, we read these words in verse 9. Jesus became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. From that verse, I want to emphasize 3 points. The first one is the word source. Jesus became the source of eternal salvation. The source is important. Knowing what the source is absolutely important. There's a story about a man who was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at a very large national banquet. Hundreds of people had filled the banquet hall waiting to hear the speech that he was about to give. But as he was eating his dinner, the meal before he spoke, he bit down on a chicken bone and he broke his dentures. In his panic, he whispered to the man sitting next to him, I can't believe this. I just broke my dentures and I have to speak in a couple of minutes. No problem, the man whispered back to him. I think I can help. And with that, this man reached down into his briefcase and pulled out 3 sets of false teeth. In a Goldilocks type moment, the speaker tried the first pair and it was too tight. The second pair was too loose, but the third pair fit just right. It was a perfect fit. Now totally relieved, the speaker was sat back and enjoyed the rest of his meal, delivered an excellent speech for which he received a standing ovation. And at the end of the evening, he walked up to his benefactor and thanked him for his help. You really did me a favor tonight, he said. You know, I've been looking for a good dentist for quite a while now. Where's your office located? The other man smiled and replied, Oh, I'm not a dentist. I'm an undertaker. It's important to know the source, right? Find out as much as you can about the source. So when the text says Jesus is the source of our salvation, what does that mean? Where does salvation come from? It comes from Jesus and only Jesus. He's the source. The source is the point of origin, the place where it all starts. The source of the great Mississippi River is a small lake in central Minnesota, Lake Itasca. That's where it all starts. Jesus is the source, the originator, the beginning place of all of our salvation, of all the salvation that we need. That's how John the Baptist described him in the Gospel of John. He said, that's the one. He's the one who brings the forgiveness of sin. That's why God told Joseph and Mary to name Jesus Jesus, because that name means salvation. He saves the people from their sins. In fact, it's how God described what his plan of salvation was way back in Genesis 3, right after Adam and Eve committed the sin. He told them that there was going to be one who would come, who would be the salvation, the source of their salvation. Genesis chapter 3. You're always wise whenever someone says something to ask them, what is your source? Lots of people claim to know something or to be something, but they're usually just relaying on what they heard, and usually it's wrong. In Harvard University student manual about writing academic papers, they tell students that no matter what you're working on, keep in mind that not all sources are appropriate. Just because someone has written something down doesn't mean it's a reliable source. And we might add, just because they say it doesn't mean it's a reliable source. Look closely at Jesus. Look at Jesus. And when you do, you will find that he is reliable as a source. He is more than reliable as the source of your salvation. And when it comes to things like where I'm going to spend eternity, I need to have something very reliable to count on, to bank on at that point. Jesus is the source of my eternal salvation. That's the second phrase, second point. He's the source of my eternal salvation. Our friends at the Navigator Discipleship Ministry have created this simple little tool to help us understand the concept of salvation. It's something you can easily use wherever you are. In a conversation, just get out your pencil and draw a sketch on the back of a napkin, a piece of paper, wherever it may be. It's something that can help easily communicate what the truth of the gospel is. And the picture works like this. On the left-hand side, you see a man, us, standing on the edge of a cliff, clear on the opposite side of the cliff from where God is. And we see in the words that are underneath him that we're there, and we cannot get over to where God is because the wages of sin is death. That's Romans 6:23, which this illustration is built upon. The wages of our sin, the cost, the penalty for the sin that we have is death. And we're totally separated from God. But because of Jesus, our source, Jesus creates a bridge that gives to us the opportunity to spend eternity in heaven with God. And we cross over Jesus through our belief in him. Jesus is the source of our eternal salvation. It's because of Jesus we can find life. So salvation is in essence crossing over from death into life because of what Jesus Christ has done for us. That's an important concept. If you want to talk more about that, there are a number of us in the church, including me, who would love to tell you more about what that means and how you can apply it to your life. And we welcome that conversation. But it's important for all of us to know that because of Christ, the only way we can make it into heaven is by placing our faith totally in him. We cross over through him. And the third point out of that verse that I want to highlight this morning is the fact that this is for people who obey him. He became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. This part of the scripture verse reminds me of the old conundrum. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which comes first, we might say, our obedience or our salvation? Does obedience result in salvation, or does salvation result in a life of obedience? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Now, we've never really been able to solve the chicken and egg riddle, but the obedience and salvation one's pretty easy to solve. The whole Old Testament, along with all of your personal experience, my personal experience, tell us that we can never be obedient enough to gain the salvation that Jesus Christ wants to give to us. We try, and just about the time we think we're starting to master something, we fall down and we make a big mistake, and we realize that we will never be able to do anything that makes us worthy of a place in heaven. We need help, which is why Paul says in the book of Ephesians that salvation is all God's idea and it's all his work. All we do is trust in him enough to let him do it. It's God's gift from start to finish. We don't play a major role. If we did, we'd probably go around bragging that we'd done the whole thing. No, we neither make or save ourselves. God does both the making and the saving. He is the source, and it's in our part, it's obedience. But after that salvation comes, the natural result of that wonderful gift of God is that we want to do the things that please God. We want to do the things that make God happy, and that's what this text talks about when it's talking about a life of obedience. So picture again that mighty Mississippi River. Its source, Lake Itasca, central Minnesota, flows south and empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Our salvation begins with Jesus Christ. And then the life that we live after that is a life of obedience because of our love and appreciation for what God has done for us. We flow on with Him. In our world today, there are a lot of people who think they have the ultimate answers for the most important questions in life. Some of them are running for political office. Some of them are writing op-ed pieces for newspapers and magazines. Some of them are creating social media posts. But unless what those people have to say and have to offer ultimately points you towards Jesus, they're pointing in the wrong direction. Jesus is the source. It's what Psalm 20 says when it proclaims, "Now this is what I know. The Lord gives victory to His anointed. He answers him from His heavenly sanctuary with the victorious power of His right hand. Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." Jesus alone is the source of eternal salvation for all who put their trust in Him. Look to Jesus. Always look to Jesus. Start with Jesus. Focus your eyes upon Jesus. Make sure that you, of all things, see Jesus. Amen.